Addressing the substance of what I want to talk about today, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the particular anxiety of this day. We're sitting today, all of us, with a lot of uncertainty about our futures, and that's not easy. And it's my hope that our learning today may help us a little bit with that, just help us to manage that uncertainty and offer a way to both to hold it and also to elevate it. Okay, so happiness. As Rabbi Andelman said, most of us are enculturated into a belief in happiness as a major part of what life is about. We want to be happy. We want our children to be happy, our loved ones to be happy. And a lot of times we use happiness as a measure of how we're doing in life. Maybe not the only measure, but a significant one. We know the saying, you're only as happy as your least happy child. And we tend to feel, I think, if we're not happy, then something's wrong. And we see it as a goal. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what we're aiming for. So is happiness, in that sense, a Jewish concept, at least from the perspective of the Torah? Now, one way to answer that question, or to get at an answer to that question, is by looking at the Torah's narratives. Does the Torah describe its protagonists and heroes as happy? And the short answer is not so much. We learn in Exodus 4 that God tells Moses that his brother Aaron will rejoice at seeing him. We learn in Genesis 31, after Jacob has run away from his father-in-law, Laban's house, that Laban says, probably disingenuously, "Why did you leave secretly? You should have told me. I would have thrown you a party and rejoiced with you." Both of those references use the word simcha for joy, and both are highly situational. I'll throw you a farewell party, or I'll celebrate our reunion, isn't really, I think, what most of us mean when we think, am I happy in life? Right? It's a different, more situational experience. There is a third reference to an individual being happy, and that's in Genesis 30. I gave it to you as text number 1 with respect to Leah, who was certainly not what we would think of as one of the happiest people in the Torah. Leah has a hard life. Leah wants only the love of her husband, Jacob. Jacob wants only the love of his other wife, Rachel. And Rachel wants only children, which is, for most of her life, denied her. It's a pretty unhappy trio. And yet Leah is described as this one moment in Genesis 30, verses 12 and 13, when her maidservant Zilpah bears a second son. Leah says, "Be'oshri," what fortune, it's usually translated, by which she means, "Ishruni banot," women will see me as fortunate. And so she names this child Asher, from the same root as Oshri and Ishruni, Asher. We'll come back to that word. But other than that, those 3 instances, neither the patriarchs, nor the matriarchs, nor Moses, nor really anyone else is ever described as happy. They're described as blessed, quite frequently. That's different. Were they happy? We don't know. And the Torah doesn't seem to care. And certainly we know from the lives of the patriarchs and the matriarchs and Moses that blessing doesn't equal ease or comfort or satisfaction or getting what we want, many of the things we would associate with happiness. I don't know how many of us would choose their lives and say, oh, that would make me happy, in the way we usually use the term. So from the perspective of the Torah narratives, we might say, no, this notion of American Western happiness is not a Jewish concept, it's not a biblical concept. A second way we might get at it, at that question, whether happiness is a Jewish concept, at least from the perspective of the Torah, is linguistically. I have to say, like, if you go to Israel and you hear kids on the playgrounds, it's one of my favorite Hebrew expressions. You will hear kids when they're playing saying, "Ze lo fair." That's not fair, right? And they always use the word fair in English, "Ze lo fair." Why? Because there are certain English words that have no real counterpart in Hebrew. Fair is one. That the way we think of fairness in English just doesn't translate. And happiness is another. There really isn't a word in Hebrew that translates directly, fully equivalently to happiness. And that tells us something about sort of what we call a Yiddish Kopf, right? What is a Jewish concept? If there's no word for it, it's not really a concept that we have. We've already encountered simcha as a word, right? It's one of the ways we might readily try to translate happiness. And it definitely overlaps, but it's not exact. Simcha is more joy or to rejoice rather than being happy. And it appears with some frequency beyond the two examples I gave you in the Torah, but mostly in connection with rejoicing on the festivals. It's used situationally, joy or rejoicing in response to something, or as an expression of gratitude to God, not so much an ongoing state or a goal in and of itself. And I do think that the closest Hebrew word that we have to the American Western notion of happy is ashrei. Fortunate, blessed, happy, the word we saw in connection with Leah and the name Asher. And ashrei is a word that is very familiar to those of us who attend synagogue or who pray regularly at home, because we have it in our liturgy. And we have it most notably in the prayer that is called Ashrei, which in traditional liturgy, we pray 3 times a day. Ashrei is actually a rabbinic composition. The bulk of the prayer is comprised of Psalm 145 in its entirety, but there are 2 verses tacked on to the beginning of the psalm and 1 verse that's tacked on to the end of the psalm. And the 2 at the beginning, from Psalms 84 and 144, both begin with the word Ashrei. Ashrei yoshvei beitecha. Happy is the one who dwells in your house, or blessed is the one, or fortunate is the one, something like that. We also have the word Ashrei in the morning blessings. We'll look at the text closely later. I don't want to turn to it now, but for those who are regular daveners, it'll be familiar. Ashreinu, ma tov chelkeinu, fortunate are we. How good is our portion, how lovely is our lot, how beautiful our inheritance. Ashreinu. How fortunate are we that we get to get up every morning and early, and every night we get to say twice a day, Shema Yisrael, right? Ashreinu, fortunate are we. And we have the word again when we return the Torah scroll to the ark. We sing a verse from Proverbs, Etz Chaim hi, right? Etz chaim hi lamachazichim ba. Vetomchea meushar. Meushar is the same word as ashrei. Etz chaim here is a tree of life for those who grasp it, and all who uphold it are meushar. Happy? Maybe? Fortunate? Something. The root ashrei in various forms is all over the Psalms. We see it also in the writings and in the prophets in the Hebrew Bible. But in the Torah itself, in the 5 books of Moses, from Genesis to Deuteronomy, other than that one reference to Leah that we looked at earlier, that one reference, and then the name Asher, who is one of Jacob's sons, and so the name appears. The root of Ashrei appears exactly one more time in the Torah, once only, one more, but not in an insignificant way. If you look at text number 9 in your packet, you will see Deuteronomy 33:29. Almost the very end of the Torah, Ashrecha Yisrael. Happy are you, O Israel. Fortunate are you, O Israel. Mi chamocha, who is like you, a people rescued by the Lord, your shield of help and the sword of your triumph. Your enemies cower before you, and you on their backs will tread. Now, what's significant about this ashrecha, this ashrei, is that these are Moses' last words in the Torah. This is the last sentence that he speaks. Ashrecha Yisrael is Moses' last legacy to us. And it seems a little bit odd because Ashrecha is a word that we really don't entirely understand. So why is he leaving us with that? He doesn't say, blessed are you, which we might expect. Ashrecha. And it happens also that Ashrei is the very first word in the book of Psalms. Psalm 1, verse 1 begins, Ashrei ha'ish. Happy is the person. Fortunate, blessed, whatever, is the person, Ashrei. And the Midrash says that that David, who the Psalms are attributed to, the psalmist, picked up where Moses left off. We might say in some ways that the whole book of Psalms then is an attempt to figure out what is this ashrecha that Moses is leaving us with. So that's really where I want to spend the bulk of our time today, is interrogating this ashrei experience or this ashrei condition. What are we talking about? What does it really mean? So maybe I'll just pause here for a second and make sure that we're all together. Any questions at this point before we start interrogating what this means?
We have a comment from Laura Zinker, and I have a feeling you're probably going to go more into this, but she said that the Jewish/Torah philosophical perspective on happiness seems less self-oriented and more community-oriented, as is much of Jewish practice. That we both rejoice and mourn, not in isolation, but in community.
Yeah, beautiful. It's a beautiful thought, and yes, I will definitely go more into that. Although it is and it isn't. It is. Simcha tends to be the communal experience of rejoicing together on the festivals. We gather and experience simcha. In the book of Esther, simcha, joy, is the collective response. Ashrei, I will get to this. I want to hold off saying too much about it for now, but Ashrei really holds something of a balance between that individual and collective. So if there's is there anything else? If not, I'll go on.
There's a lot of probing from a lot of people about, this word ashrei and what it actually means: blessed, praiseworthy, fortunate. And then actually the last comment that just came in from Sherry, she's noting that it almost seems more like the American concept of luck. I guess it's like fortunate.
Yeah, and it is sometimes
this great situation.
It is sometimes translated that way as lucky, like fortunate in the sense of lucky, and that's exactly where I'm going. So maybe I'll flesh out a little more. So what does this word mean? Does it mean what we think happy means? Robert Alter, in his magnificent new translation and commentary on the entire Tanakh, reads the root of ashrei as precisely that, good fortune. The primary use of which, he says, is to call out to a lucky person, ashrei, happy is he, she, they. So two things about this. One is that ashrei is often used in that exhortative sense of declaring something. Ashrei, happy are you, happy are they, happy is she, as a declaration or an exhortation. That's number one. But number two, without questioning Robert Alter's scholarship, I'm not finding that sense of lucky or good fortune totally satisfying. Certainly not as Moses's last words to us. I think that would actually be kind of bizarre. Like, you're lucky. That seems strange to me. Or as the opening of the whole book of Psalms. It's not a satisfying definition to me. And I really do think that one of the challenges we have here is that it's a word that, just as happy has no exact equivalent in Hebrew, ashrei has no exact equivalent in English. It needs to be sort of fleshed out with a whole series of associations. So to go deeper, I want to look at a Torah narrative that may at first seem very far afield from this question, but I promise you it will come back and we'll link it up. So if you look at text number 2, this is a passage from the book of Numbers, from Bamidbar, chapter 27, verses 1 to 11. And it's a narrative that is known as the story of the daughters of Slophahad. So here's what we have. The daughters of Slophahad, of the Menashite family, son of Hefer, son of Gilad, son of Machir, son of Menashe, son of Yosef, came forward. Vatikravna, they came forward. The names of the daughters were Machla, Noah, Chogla, Milka, and Tirza. They stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the chieftains, and the whole assembly at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and they said, "Our father died in the wilderness. He was not one of the faction of Korach's faction, which banded together against Adonai. But he died for his own sin, and he left no sons. Let not our father's name be lost to his clan just because he had no son. Tana lanu achuzah. Give us a holding among our father's kinsmen." So one thing I want to highlight in the translation, this is the JPS translation. In the Hebrew, what is translated as "let not our father's name" is actually the word lama. Why? The question they ask is why. We'll come back to that later. Just hold that thought. Okay, so Moses brought their case to Adonai. I always think of like a cartoon image here of Moses standing there and saying, hold that thought, wait, let me ask, right? Moses goes back and asks God, what do we do here? And God says to Moses, Ken benot Slophahad dovrot. The translation here, the plea of Slophahad's daughter is just. A more sort of hyper-literal translation would be, yes, Ken, yes, exactly, or rightly, the daughters of Slophahad speak. You should give them a hereditary holding among their father's kinsmen, transfer their father's share to them. Further, speak to the Israelite people as follows. If a man dies without leaving a son, you shall transfer his property to his daughter. If he has no daughter, you shall assign his property, etc., etc. This shall be the law of the procedure for the Israelites in accordance with Adonai's command to Moses. So what's going on here? The context of this narrative is as the people are nearing the end of the wandering in the wilderness and they are contemplating entering the land, there now has to be discussion and law about how the land will be distributed. And there's discussion about the law of inheritance, and only sons can inherit. And these 5 women go publicly before the entire community, and the text articulates before Moses and Eleazar the priest and the leaders and the whole community, and they say, why? Why should this be? We have a unique case. Our father has no sons. What does that mean? His property is just gonna pass to other people and his name will die out as his property goes. Why should that be? And Moses doesn't know the answer, and God intervenes, and the oracle, the divine voice says, they're right. I'm changing the law. The law that Moses just said is going to evolve. We're going to have a new ruling. Okay, so there's so many ways of reading this text. It's such a rich narrative. We could talk about it as a text about social justice and societal change. We could talk about what it says about the nature of Torah and halacha and how that evolves. We could talk about it as being about the vision of the outsider and how the outsider sees what the insider does. So many ways of reading this. What does this have to do with happiness? And I'm indebted to the great scholar Aviva Zornberg for some of this reading. We need to look at Rashi to understand what it has to do with happiness. I gave it to you as text number 3. Rashi, the premier commentator on the Torah, born in 1040 in Provence, says as follows. What does this mean? Ken benot Slophahad dovrot, the daughters of Slophahad speak Cain rightly. As the Aramaic translator, the Targum Onkelos renders, Ye'ut, properly. That is, God says, thus is this passage written before me on high. This tells us that their eye saw that which Moses' eye did not see. And then, Ken benot Slophahad dovrot, the daughters of Slophahad speak properly. They claimed correctly, yafeh, beautifully. And then, Ashrei Adam, shehakadosh baruch hu modeh lidvarav. Fortunate, Ashrei, is the person whose words the Holy Blessed One, God, confirms, agrees with. What do we have here? After Rashi explicates the text, as he usually does, he does something different and something that is very, very unusual for him. because that last line of his commentary isn't really explicating the text. It's sort of a personal exclamation, an exhortation to us. Ashrei Adam, fortunate is the person. It's not the only time that Rashi uses this expression. But elsewhere, when he uses it, he's usually putting words in someone else's mouth. Like he says, he imagines, for example, Moses saying to Aaron, Ashrecha, lucky you. Or Moses telling Joshua, Ashrecha, lucky you, fortunate are you that you get to lead the people. But here, Rashi's speaking as himself. And he seems to be interjecting a personal note to us as reader that is both celebratory, how happy, how wonderful are these women? Happy is the person who does this, but also aspirational, creating possibility, teaching us. It's like Rashi is jumping off the page and saying, pay attention, you reader, you studier of Torah. Down this road, happiness lies. This is the experience you want. This. And what is this experience? Happy is the one to whom God says yes. Happy is the one whose words God affirms. If there is a Jewish definition of happiness, this is it, right? Our notion of happiness here is the one who God agrees with. Now, that may be inspiring, but it's also kind of challenging. How do we know? What does that mean? Most of us don't have a divine voice jumping in and saying, you're right, I agree with you. I'm changing the Torah according to your words. That would be lovely. I can assure you that has never happened to me, right? So what is this experience? How do we know? What does it feel like? What is it about? I think we can't really fully define what we mean by ashrei, meushar, but we can point to its meaning with some poetic associations from the daughters of Slophahad, from the narrative and the way that Rashi and also Aviva Zornberg interpret it. So first of all, ken benot Slophahad dovrot. They speak rightly. Ken is a word that has associations of stability, of something firm and lasting. And the word ashrei, too, some say, is related to a Hebrew root that means to set right, to go straight and to be on sure footing, to be rooted or grounded in something lasting. Now, I want to be very clear, and I'll say more about this later. It's not about things not changing. Note that this is a narrative in which the thing that we think is most lasting, which is the text of the Torah and the written text of the Torah, already is subject to change. Moses decrees, the daughters of Slophahad say, why should that be? And God says, oh, they're right, amend what I said earlier, right? One of my favorite lines, by the way, anytime I teach anything, is fundamentally the Torah is an anti-fundamentalist text. And this is an example of why. Because it's already self-contradictory. And Rashi's read, right? Thus is it written to me on high, opens up a whole field of Torah interpretation, which is beyond our scope for today. But I just want to highlight that there may be a gap between what God wants to convey through Torah and what we experience and receive and hear below. What I have on high is what the daughters of Slophahad said, not what you, Moses, wrote in the book. That's what Rashi is saying. Okay, so it's not a sense that nothing ever changes, but yet a sense of being rooted in something lasting. Who doesn't want that? Right? Especially in this time. Who wouldn't want a sense of a sure footing today? That's number one. Note also that in Rashi's commentary, he's pointing out that the daughters see what Moses doesn't see, right? But that is nevertheless true. That is ken. That is just so in God's eyes. They have a higher vision and the ability to seize the moment with exquisite timing, such that God confirms their words just so. That's part of the Ashrei experience too. Different from what we would describe as kind of happy in the sense that I'm having a good time, but in the sense of being and doing the right thing at the right moment, in the right place, in the right way, such that either I feel rooted, stable, on firm ground, despite change, or that I touch something in a changing world that is itself rooted and stable, that is the firm ground. Right? It's the experience of, we may not hear God saying, Ken, you speak rightly, but we feel an inner sense of, yes, yes. This feels deeply true at a level that is beneath or above, whichever metaphor you prefer, or beyond kind of the surface noise in life and all the things that change. I feel like I'm touching something more rooted than that. That's a hint of the Ashrei experience. In that sense, the Ashrei experience isn't so much about getting what we want, necessarily, it may be, so much as the sense that we're speaking and acting in accordance with God's version of things, something bigger than us. And according to Malbim, who was a 19th century commentator in Ukraine, when Rashi says, "Thus is it written before me in the Torah," this refers not just to their words, and not just to the legal claim and the result. They're right on the halakha, God says, not just that, but the whole narrative context, the whole scene, the whole way they're living in the moment is already written before God on high. And so the Ashrei experience is that sense of bringing ourselves and some little part of the world that we can influence more into accord with the divine vision. It's to riff a little bit on that line that is so often attributed to Lincoln, that we shouldn't pray that God is on our side, but that we pray to be on God's side. Right? The Ashrei experience seems to emerge from that sense. Not that we're getting what we want, but that what we're working for and what we think is right is actually what God wants, that we are on God's side. That sense of rightness and the attendant experience of rootedness is the cause, or maybe the definition, of happiness. So let me pause here for a minute, because that's already a chunk. And before I go into some other hallmarks of how we might know, any thoughts, questions at this point?
Rabbi, I think something might have happened to your microphone for a minute. If you go back and repeat just the last.
Tanya, I think it might be your internet, actually.
Yeah.
I'll go ahead. I'll go ahead and share a couple of questions / comments
Sure.
that came in. So really, very much in line with what you were just saying. So, so Ian has been looking up, since you've been talking, uses of the word ashrei in the Tanakh, and found them frequently in the book of Psalms, Sefer Tehillim, referring to happiness in relation to attachment to God. So I think that that's really where you were just going at the end.
Right.
But I'm also getting we're getting a lot of comments about merit and about theodicy, meaning, you know, if happiness is being on God's side, as you said, but the flip side is not always true, that when you're on the side of the right or the just, or however we might think of being on God's side, that we then necessarily wind up in a good place, right?
Yeah. Okay. So this is where I think I'm going to delve into this a little bit more as we go, but this is where I think the notion of ashrei, the Hebrew concept of ashrei, really departs a little bit from the literal meaning of happy or fortunate, because I think that what it really is referring to is the sense of being on God's side. And I want to expand that beyond, explicitly theistic notions, like for those who, for whom God language is not the way you speak, right? It's not just, we don't have to necessarily think of an interventionist, anthropomorphized God, but a sense of rightness in one's, in it as part of a larger oneness, a larger existence of which we are a part, a larger will for the good. And so it's not necessarily getting what I want or feeling comfortable or happy in the sense of, yay, life is easy. This is the, it's a different notion than that. It's a feeling of rightness and rootedness that may or may not be always entirely comfortable or without challenge in life, right? It's different. And so the question of theodicy, of, why do bad things happen to good people and why do bad people prosper, this is really different from prospering. And it's different from getting what we want. It's a sense of attunement and alignment. I'll spell it out more later. Julia, were there more at this point?
I'll just share one more question. So the way I was hearing what you were just saying is that the alignment with God, that's the end into itself. It's not in order to.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Lori had a great point, which is, and I don't know if you want to sort of leave the thought world of the Bible yet, but she's asking, what about people who are secular, and how can we apply the concept of ashrei as you're defining it?
Yeah, so I think, so that relates to the what I just said about getting out of the theistic language. It doesn't have to be God language, right? In a secular frame, one might say that one is aligned with the good, right? One is aligned with the impulse for good, or the moral arc of the universe, if you want to use King's language, right? That there's that one is right with a sense of one's mission and purpose in the world, whether we believe that's a divinely given purpose or simply part of the essence of creation. All right, so let me unpack it a little bit more, and then we'll some of this I think will become clearer. Okay, so a few sort of more poetic associations from the Daughters of Slophahad story and the commentary that may flesh out this contours of the contours of the Ashrei experience. One, and this is from Aviva Zornberg's commentary, is that it yields a confluence of the ethical and the aesthetic. And Zornberg picks this up from Rashi's commentary, in which, in explaining the word ken benot Slophahad dovrot, they speak rightly. Rashi uses the words ya'ut and yafeh, both of which refer to an aesthetic quality of beauty. And Zornberg notes that in English, too, the word fair has both an ethical and an aesthetic quality, as does the word good. And I would add, just as we use the word ugliness to describe immorality or violence or injustice or bad behavior, right? That was a really ugly scene, or that was an ugly display of whatever, right? It's not necessarily only aesthetic, it's also moral. And I am not saying in any way, I want to be clear about this, that more physically attractive people are more moral, right? If anything, it's the other way around, that the ethical, moral yields beauty in the person and in the gestalt of the experience. There's a kind of grace or elegance that we recognize when we see it, that emerges from the Ashrei experience in oneself or another. The sense of rightness has an aesthetic aspect to it. And I want to suggest that it's where the ethical and the moral is also aesthetically elevating. Where it touches that connection, we have a sense of Ashrei, things being right. That there was beauty in that moment. There was an elegance to it, a grace and a graciousness, right? The Daughters of Slophahad, in the way they present it, have this graciousness that is part of Ashrei. The second piece, and these are just sort of poetic associations to give us the feel, because we can't nail it down precisely. The second association with the Ashrei experience is that it involves authorship. Authorship in the sense of instrumentality and agency, and in a different sense as well. Where does this come from? Rashi again, text number 4, on this section. An alternative reading he offers is, it was fitting that this passage be written through Moses, meaning Moses should have written this law about daughters inheriting, but the daughters of Slophahad were meritorious, and it was written through them. They got to write Torah. That's amazing, right? Like, Torah was written in their name. And to author Torah in our time, what does that mean for us? It's to live in such a way that others may learn from your life. Right? That you live in such a way that you become a role model and others may learn. And I want to say, we've only recently been through the High Holy Days, in which we prayed over and over and over to be inscribed in the Book of Life. What does that mean? Inscribed in the Book of Life, B'Sefer Chaim. On one level, it means we want another year of life. That's the sort of plain meaning. We want to keep living. Nothing wrong with that. The text, the prayer absolutely means that. But it means more than that, because we know that every year good people die. We're all mortal. It's going to happen at some point. So B'Sefer Chaim also is the Torah. And what we're really praying for, I think, on these high holy days is precisely this. I want to author something lasting. I want to have agency in my life, that I leave a legacy that could be a model for someone else. May my life be written in your book of life, in your Torah. That's what it means, right? So the Ashrei experience is the moment when we claim our role as co-author with God. We claim or the universe, or the ground of being. When we become authors of our own identities, our own lives, and some part of the world with us. So the first thing is that confluence of the ethical and the aesthetic. The second is a sense of agency and of authoring some part of something that is eternal, because it is a lesson and a role model for others. The third thing, and we touched on this in the first question, the Ashrei experience of, quote, happiness depends on an emergence from an awareness of being part of something bigger than oneself. Maybe we call this God, maybe we call this Judaism, maybe we call this community, maybe we call this collective unconscious, whatever it is. For the daughters in the original narrative, their claim wasn't quite the rights-based social justice argument that some of us would like to see it as. It was more complicated than that. It was rights and responsibilities together. Yes, they claimed we should inherit as daughters, but they did it for two reasons. The impulse came from a responsibility to their father. Why should our father's name be lost? The desire to perpetuate his name. And B, a love for the land. Remember, this is the scene right as we're ending the wandering in the wilderness, and we're about to think about apportioning the land, and they say, we want to share in it. Now, what is the land? The land is the redemptive vision that the spies back in chapter 14 of Numbers rejected. We don't want that vision. It's too scary for us. And these women stood up and said, we do. We want, God, what you want for the Jewish people. We want this redemptive vision. We want to be part of it. They are seeking a long-term, lasting inheritance in God's plan. Note the tension they're holding here. This is not a denial of self. It's actually an assertion of self. We'll come back to that later, but not in a selfish way. It's certainly not a materialistic grasping, oh, we want. It's rather a finely attuned sense of one's place and importance in a larger vision. It's holding both. My life is not all about me, and I matter. Both of those things at once. So that's the third thing. The fourth thing, the last association from the daughters of Slophahad and that narrative, is the Ashrei experience is a sense of in Zornberg's language, acquiring one's world. The whole story of the daughters of Slophahad is about inheritance, one's heritage, one's true portion. They seek a holding, an achuzah, in the land. But it's not only about the land, it's about their spiritual inheritance, their mission. To come back to Malbim, who I quoted earlier, in his commentary on the word ashrei, in the first word of the first psalm, he picks up on the language ashrei ha'ish. And he says that ashrei, because it says ashrei ha'ish, happy is the person, ashrei refers to a uniquely human experience that is related to the life of the soul. And he says that we can speak of fulfillment, of wholeness, in three realms: possessions, the body, and the soul. The first two, stuff and the body, animals can have. And maybe even more than we. Some other animals attain their sustenance more easily than we do. Don't have to work as hard. And some have stronger bodies and capacities that we don't have. They see better than we do. They hear better than we do. They sense things we don't sense. But ashrei is the fulfillment of refined character and spiritual qualities, which can only be achieved by the human being. Ashrei ha'ish. Ashrei is a uniquely human experience. So I have to tell you, I happen to love dogs. One of the reasons I love dogs is because if you have a relationship with a dog, it's very hard to be unhappy in the usual sense of the word, right? You take a dog for a walk, a dog thinks everything is the greatest thing there ever was in life, right? Where the dog is, you walk down the street and this smell is the greatest thing ever and that person is the greatest thing ever, and it's hard not to be happy when you witness that kind of happiness, right? That is not what this is talking about. It's a good thing. I'm not knocking it, right? It's wonderful to feel that kind of joy. That's not this. Human beings are capable of a deeper, different kind of happiness than an animal is, according to Malbim, that comes from fulfilling our humanity. And if we bring together the Malbim's reading with the daughters of Slophahad, the ashrei experience is about both acquiring the fullness of our humanity in the general sense and discovering, claiming, inheriting the fullness of our own unique purpose and mission, the specifics of our own selfhood, becoming who we are meant to be and living with that purpose. Those moments when you sense, yes, this is the most authentically me that I could be. That's what I meant earlier, saying it's both connection beyond oneself and an assertion of the self. I am most me in this. I'll pause in just a minute for more questions, but I just want to say, if any of you have done any reading, and I am by no means an expert or a scholar of this, but I read around in it for my own personal edification, in either the field of positive psychology, right, the book Flow, for example, or some of the more recent, research in cognitive science to the experience of what we sometimes call happiness, but what I think is better framed as this Ashrei experience, the work of Daniel Gilbert or Daniel Pink and Drive. All of that research points to this whole constellation that we've just articulated, a connection to something outside oneself, autonomy and creativity, authorship, authenticity, passion, and a sense of attunement. Right? Research actually shows that that is when we have those things, much more than when we get material things that we want, or even when we have the relationships we want in life. Those things are the key to a feeling of well-being that we might associate with this Ashrei. So let me pause once more before I go to the next level for any questions on this.
Okay, so I want to pull from a few comments and questions that have come in from Pam Dorman and Sherry Allen and a few others. So Pam was articulating what you were talking, your definition of Ashrei as feeling right with the mission of the world, which I thought was a helpful way of putting it. And she also points out that that can also lead to zealousness. And Sherry was noting that she was wondering, does this way of thinking about Ashrei, is it dependent on sort of how things are going in the world? Like, if we could have a notion of rightness, of ethical and moral rightness, but if we don't see that existing in the world around us, you know, what are we right with, and how do we achieve that sense of Ashrei? And I think it's, you know, at this time of, I think a degree of polarization here in the U.S. that's become frightening. Right, it's interesting to ask this question. If we if we achieve that sense of wholeness, or however we want to translate Ashrei as a sense of conviction in the rightness of our path, that can go in some concerning directions.
Yes. So the question of the latter question of things not going right in the world, I want to hold for a minute because I'm going to deal with that. But the question about the risk of zealotry, and I think is a really important and good one. And first of all, the narrative of the Daughters of Slophahad itself is a little bit of a check on that. In part because, first of all, the law evolves later. Right? In this particular moment in the narrative that I gave us the little quote from, that God confirms their words. Later in the narrative, there's an objection that some of the tribes bring and say, well, wait a minute, if daughters are now able to inherit, then what happens if they marry out of the tribe? And then things can get really off balance, and one tribe can lose its holding in the land, and that's going to be a problem. And so they alter the law, and the daughters are then these particular daughters, but the law generally is then becomes that in order to, if they're going to inherit this way, they have to marry within the tribe, right? And these women do. Now, whatever we want to say from a feminist perspective about that particular law, I want to bracket for the moment, but it models a kind of humility and a flexibility that is not that zealotry, that is not that, no, I'm right, and anything that doesn't 100% agree with me must be wrong. So that's one thing. The other thing is that part of the implications of being connected to something larger than oneself, whether we consider that God or we use secular language of however we may frame it, is that it implies a certain humility. One cannot hold both, the sense that it is not all about me and the sense that I matter in a real way, without being humble and open to the possibility that one is wrong. right? And I realize that this is, this is a little bit dicey stuff, precisely because we don't have God saying to anybody, Ken, you speak rightly. But that's also the saving grace. We don't have anyone speaking to us and saying, from a divine perspective, you are right. And so we hold the Ashrei experience a little bit more lightly than that. And we strive for the courage of our convictions with an openness that we may be wrong, or we may need to adjust, or we may not succeed. That latter piece I want to hold later. And it's not so, and it is a process of discernment, right? It's not a cheap, easy feeling of, yeah, I'm right. And I think in some ways that's, Paul, you raised the issue of the polarization in our society right now. One of the problems with this, with the public discourse that we have, is that we are engaging in discussions about matters of life and death and ultimate issues of values, as though we were in a sports arena rooting for teams, right? And we're not bringing the nuance and the humility and the sense of discernment about what is right, so much as a sense of wanting to win. And the Ashrei experience is very different. It's precisely not about striving to win, as striving to feel a sense of attunement with a beautiful rightness beyond ourselves. And this, by the way, is one of the reasons why I raised that point about the confluence of the ethical and the beautiful. Because if our sense of rightness leads to real ugliness, something isn't quite right. Right? And we should be looking at what's going on here. I'm mindful of time, and I want to leave questions at the end. So other questions, or should I sort of wind up and then we'll hold everything else to the end?
Maybe we can squeeze in one more now. Well, I wanted to just share a comment that you're talking about humility. But a while back, Harvey shared with us what his Rabbi Lipnick, I think that's Rabbi Bernard Lipnick, taught him, that he said has had a profound influence on him. He said, here's the quote: "The purpose of my life is not my happiness, but to be worthy of happiness."
Beautiful.
It's beautiful, and it goes very much with what you're saying. The question is, I'm pulling together from a few different, there's so many things in the chat now, I can't even find who wrote what, but there were a few people commenting on, is this, do you think this kind of ashrei that you're talking about, is it a fleeting kind of coming and going, or a peak experience, or is it sort of an ultimate achievement, like arriving at a certain wholeness of it in your life?
So I think it's sort of a combination of both. I would not say it's a peak achievement, a peak moment. I think that's more a sense of more of what I would associate with joy, with simcha, but neither is it fleeting. I think it's an experience that we can come back to and be faithful to, that waxes and wanes, that we don't always necessarily experience at the same level of intensity, but that we can return to. And this, by the way, is one of the ways we can think about faith, right? Like, for faith is faithfulness too. This is something about like being faithful to ourselves. It becomes the point that when we start to lose our footing, this is the rootedness that we come back to. It doesn't mean we never lose our footing. It means that we have a measure that is both within and beyond ourselves, that we can re-anchor ourselves in and return to. So it's not fleeting, but neither is it unwavering. I'd put it that way. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So okay, because this is where I think it gets a little harder and really, really countercultural. Ashrei as a sense of inheritance, of claiming one's true self and one's mission. Inheritance, yes, acquiring one's world and self, but it's an active thing. It doesn't just happen to us. It's not an inheritance in the sense that it gets passed on to you. It has to be claimed, and it can be lost. And most especially, it involves risk. It involves taking a stance. It involves an articulation of self. This Ashrei experience emerges from the courage to say, I am, in a generous way, to become in a nonconformist, upright way, with no guarantee in advance that the response will be ken, either from God or other people. As Zornberg says on the Daughters of Slophahad, without assurance that they will be heard, they allow themselves to be known. So the Ashrei experience involves risking rejection, or risking being wrong, or risking being dismissed, or risking failure. It doesn't come from playing it safe. Now, I say a generous courage in the sense that it demands the offering of who I am to the project of the world. I'm going to risk contributing me to this crazy, complicated, scary, sometimes hostile, sometimes indifferent world. I'm going to risk being authentically who I am. The daughters sense that something is not right, unjust in the status quo. And they ask, I highlighted this for you when I read it, Lama, why this? Why should we allow X to cause Y? This is the courage to stand against the status quo, against convention. It's an intuition that this world that I'm seeing can't be what God really wants. That this can't be what the Torah really says. And to say why to the status quo is scary. Because to ask why is an inherently destabilizing question. It's an opening to change. Why does this have to be this way? Why do I have to be this way? So paradoxically, that sense of ken, of stability and rootedness and a foothold, and one's lasting inheritance arises from the willingness to enter into instability and even to cause instability. So it is, I think everything I've been saying up to this point, the Ashrei experience isn't happiness in the sense of comfort and safety. And it isn't stability in the sense of certainty. It's learning and growing and risking. Very often in the Psalms and other parts of the Tanakh, we see the word Ashrei associated, yes, with closeness to God and with Torah and with Halakha, but most often not in a static way. It's usually connected to movement. And so the Ashrei experience sits in tension between progressing forward on a path and being rooted. We might even say that it emerges from the deep acceptance of change as the only stable, ongoing reality and as essential to our vitality, the stability of instability. If you take a look, for example, at Psalm 84, which I gave you as text number 7, and this is the source of the Ashrei verse that we have in Ashrei V'Techa. So this is a song about yearning for dwelling, right? And the first Ashrei verse in this psalm, which is what we pick up in the liturgy, is verse 5, Ashrei yoshvei v'techa, Ode halelucha selah. Ashrei is the person who dwells in your house, who dwells. But look at the next verse. Ashrei adam oz lovach mesilot bilvavam. Happy is the one who finds strength in you, whose mind or consciousness is always on the road. Samson Raphael Hirsch translates, whose mind is always on the pilgrim's path. The two verses together give us a sense of Ashrei is the one who dwells in God's house, knowing that to dwell in God's house means you're always moving. You're always going forward. You're always a pilgrim. Or Psalm 119, one of the most famous lines in the Psalms, Ashrei temimei derech. Happy are those who are whole on the path, who are always on the path. So the Ashrei experience involves evolution, progressing personally, evolving and working on one's own character and soul, and contributing to the evolution of humanity in some way. We don't all get to change history on the grand scale. We're not all the daughters of Slophahad who are going to make a major change in the law, but we can all advance the ball a little bit, even by evolving ourselves and teaching our children and our grandchildren and our friends and our students and people we happen to come in contact with on the street a different way of being, modeling something different, right? We're all, when you're on that path and you feel yourself becoming a better person, Ashrei. And this is some of the questions we're getting at. The path, the risks don't always pan out. They don't. I gave you as text number 5, one of my favorite texts from the Talmud, from Masechet Gittin, that one never stands firmly on the words of Torah unless one has stumbled over them. Right? To be rooted, to have a stance, to have that sense of being on the right path involves sometimes having been on the wrong path or tripped. There's no avoiding it. And very strikingly, and I think profoundly insightfully, Malbim, the commentator who I mentioned earlier, who talked about the Ashrei experience being uniquely human, consistently, in more than one place in his commentary, differentiates very specifically between being me'ushar, or the Ashrei experience, and being matzliach, successful. Right? He says very clearly, more than once, Ashrei is not success. It's something else. He does it in his commentary when Leah names Asher. How fortunate. He says, Yesh hevdel ben osher uvein hatzlacha. There is a difference between this osher ashrei and hatzlacha, success. And I think he's saying that precisely because we tend to conflate the two. You are fortunate when you succeed. And he's saying no, it's something else. He makes the same commentary on Psalms verse 1:1. And he said he makes this decision ostensibly, partly to say that success only applies to this worldly matters, to money and power and things in this world. And Ashrei refers to the spiritual realm. But I think he's getting at something even far more reaching than that. And it relates to precisely how the Ashrei experience can simultaneously be about ken, about rootedness and stability and solid footing and inheritance, and also about risk and change, and maybe even failure, which is a different kind of stability. So, one of the great challenges to the Ashrei experience and to our experience of well-being in life is what is called resulting. And this comes from some of the cognitive science research on how we make decisions. If I were to ask you to call to mind a really good decision that you made in the last year, or a really good, a little less so, but to some extent true, a really good thing that you did, right? But mostly a really good decision that you made, most likely you would think of something that had a really good result. You would come up with something that ended well. And if I asked you for a bad decision, you would come up with something that didn't work out so well, right? You would most likely not, unless you were already thinking about it, think about, when do I feel that I really did my research and I really had a good process for making my decision? You would think about the result. Now, the problem with resulting is that it's really a very poor measure of things, not just decisions, but our actions and deeds. Because we do something in the world, and short term, it works out one way or another. And the results of what we did may look very different 5 or 10 or 20 years later. And it may look different again in another 50 or 100 years. It's true of all work for social change, right? Nothing that anyone is doing can be measured by the results of, say, one election. It's too short a time frame to know the impact of any of our deeds in the world. And it's true of everything. One never knows whether one is being effective in any given moment as a parent or a teacher or a friend. We try to say something and our words fall on deaf ears, and for 20 years, it could seem like we didn't get the message across. And in the 21st year, our words may come echoing back, and we see in something in our children that we never thought we would see and we hoped for 20 years. And sometimes we don't see it in our lifetimes. It's a poor measure resulting. And, you think about it in the daughters of Slophahad. They got the win. Think about like Supreme Court litigation now. They got the win. And then the win that they got was modified, and they lost a little of the rights that they thought they won. And maybe in another generation, it will expand, it will contract. It's too short a measure. So there has to be a different measure than resulting. And the Ashrei experience is about finding a sense of meaning and a feeling of the rightness and the worth of the deed, or of the way of being, or of our own courage to take a stand or live our values, regardless of the result. Whether we win, succeed, or we lose, or we fail. And this measure of happiness is much more stable than one that rides on outcomes. Right? It's the sense of being right in the process. So to close, I want to come back to where we began. David picked up where Moses left off. This weird sense that suddenly out of nowhere, Moses leaves us this blessing in a word that we don't understand, that is nearly absent from the entire Torah, suddenly appears at the end, and then flowers into this book of Psalms that begins with Ashrei Ha'ish. Why? Ashrei, as I said, is an exhortative term and kind of a declaration. It's what we might call performative speech. By saying it, to some extent, we make it so. And it makes sense to find it in the Psalms, which are really prayer. It's in our liturgy, because part of the function of prayer is to move us into this Ashrei mode. It's to remind us of what really makes us feel rooted and whole. It is not easy to live into the Ashrei experience. It's risky and it wavers. And the instability of it is a kind of confrontation with mortality in the broadest sense. With the sense, literally, that we will die, but more generally in the sense of limitation, of powerlessness, of meaninglessness, of failure. The two verses that were tacked on to that beginning of Psalm 145 to create the Ashrei prayer, the first one we just looked at from Psalm 84, Ashrei Yoshvei B'techa. The second one comes from Psalm 144, which is a psalm all about mortality. It follows the famous verses. What is man that you should care for him? Mortal man that you should be mindful of him. Man is like a breath. His day is a passing shadow. And then the last line. Ashrei ha'am shakachalo. Ashrei ha'am shadonai Elohav. Happy is the person who is thus. Happy is the person, Ashrei is the people whose God is Adonai. Right? Blessed, happy, fortunate, Ashrei is the person who lives in the shadow of mortality and is attached to the sense of something beyond, of the ability to make meaning, to make a difference, to be in tune with something regardless. Similarly, in the morning liturgy, in that Birchot HaShachar, I gave it to you as text 8, the Ashrenu Matov Chalkenu, right? The how fortunate are we? It follows a section in the liturgy about the limits of our ability and our power and our achievement. And it focuses on our inheritance. We have an inheritance that isn't tied to the power we feel at the moment. So the Ashrei experience arises not from ignoring mortality, it's from the risks and the slipperiness of living or the specter of meaningless that hangs over existence. It's not about pretending that's not there. It's rather from affirming and embracing an alternative stability, the possibility of making a lasting difference, whether we see it or not in our lifetimes, whether that difference is at a tangible, practical level, or whether the impact of our deeds is in a realm that we don't have access to, or a time frame beyond our own lifespan. It's a lasting impact, not in the sense of immortality, which is available to none of us, but eternality, which is available to all of us. And so we say to ourselves each day in prayer, Ashrei, we are mortal, will die, but we're committed to something bigger than us. Adonai Elohav. Adonai is our God. Or we're part of a larger goodness, the moral arc of the universe. And we have agency in co-creating a better world. Ashrenu, our portion is Torah. And every day we get to wake up and say, Shema Yisrael. There is oneness, and we're part of it. And we can affirm the unity of all things, not just in words, but deeds. We have a path forward, and we are on it, no matter what. And that is Moses's legacy to us. Those are his last words. Ashrecha Yisrael, Michamocha. Michamocha usually is applied to God, right? Who is like you, O God? Here collectively and individually to us in the image of God. And I don't think that the rest of the verse is really as militaristic, it's text 9, as it sounds. It's metaphoric. The enemy being talked about here is meaninglessness, hopelessness, stuckness. You will tread on their backs. Al bamotemo tidroch. It's hard to translate. It may mean you'll tread on their idolatrous altars. I want to suggest there's a pun here. Bamotemo includes the word mot, death. In spite of mortality, beyond death, you will keep going. Ashrecha Yisrael. And I'll end here. Rashi reads, after Moses detailed the blessings for them, he said to them, why do I need to detail each thing for you? Right? Ma li lifrot lachem kol davar. I don't have to detail all of these blessings. Hakol shalachem. You have everything. That's the Ashrecha. So thank you for your attentiveness. I'm sorry we didn't leave time at the end for questions. I can stay for about 5 minutes and then I have to go teach again. So if anybody wants to linger for just a little longer, feel free, but I know we've gone a long time already.
Thanks so much, Rabbi Uhrbach. I will share all the lovely comments with you afterwards. Just have 2 quick closing thoughts. So one, I just wanted to share a nice comment from Nancy Passo, who was connecting what you were saying with what Professor Fishbane taught last week, that to be human is to be a walker. That we are always to keep moving and always need to be able to change. So I thought that was a nice connection for those who were here last week. And the other thing I'm just really thinking about in light of your closing remarks is how much even more important what you're saying is in the context of the pandemic, when these kind of unnatural extreme circumstances do not always bring out the best in us. So I think what you're saying is a good exhortation to, there have been previous times of upheaval, and it's not, on the one hand, we need to forgive ourselves for, give ourselves flexibility. And on the other hand, we also need to keep our eye on the ball of what we want to be right with, whether it's with God or with our ultimate values. So thank you for that charge. That's how I'm taking it, as a charge anyway. Thanks for teaching today, sharing your wisdom with us. Thanks to everyone for coming. Next week, Professor Jeff Kress from our education school will be teaching, and that program is not for educators, but for all of us to think of, also for educators, but really for all of us to think about our stakes in Jewish education and how do we impart what's most meaningful to us and our core values to the next generation. So hope to see you all next week. I wish everyone as much sort of calm and equanimity this week as we can all manage, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.